Hello and welcome back to another full step-by-step PC build guide, and today I'm going to be showing you how to build a PC in the BitFenix Prodigy M 2022, and I've got the ARGB version here. So let's take a look at the other parts I'm going to be building with today. For the motherboard, I'm going to be using the MSI B660M MORTAR Wi-Fi, and this is the DDR4 version. For the CPU, I'm going to be using Intel's 12th Gen i7, the 12700K. Keeping our CPU cool, I'm going to be using an air cooler from DeepCool, it's the AK620. For RAM, I've got 32GB of Kingston Fury Beast RGB DDR4 at 3600 MHz. For storage, I'm going with a single Gen 4 NVMe M.2 SSD for this build. It's from Sabrent and it's the Rocket 4 Plus in 2TB capacity. Powering the whole build, I've got a 1000 watt fully modular gold power supply from DeepCool. It's their PQ1000M. For the graphics card, I'm going to be using the ASUS ROG STRIX RTX 3080. And the final part for today's build is the BitFenix Alchemy cable extension kit in white. Okay, that's all the parts, let's get building. The first thing I want to do is prepare the case. As we go, we'll point out the case's main features. So our tempered glass side panel is held on with two non-captive thumb screws at the back, so we need to remove the thumb screws. And once these have been removed, the panel can simply be slid backwards, tilted out and lifted away. Just before we remove our other side panel, I want to point out the I/O. So it's actually side I/O we've got rather than front I/O. It's built into the side panel. So we've got a power and reset button, we've got a separate headphone and microphone jack, we've got two USB 3.0 Type A ports and a single USB Type C port. The side panel is removed in a similar manner to the other one. We need to remove the two non-captive thumb screws at the back. Then with the thumb screws removed, we need to slide the panel backwards. It can then be tilted out and lifted away, and what you'll notice is the front I/O comes out with the panel. So having our I/O cables built into the side panel isn't going to be a great recipe for cable management. BitFenix have thought about that, and actually two of the cables are removable. So our HD audio cable will simply pull out from the panel, and we're going to be able to plug this into our motherboard before putting it in here at the end. And the other cable that is removable is for the front I/O, so again it will pull out, and this should simplify our cable management a little bit. On the top of the case we've got a mesh style dust filter which can simply be lifted away. With the dust filter at the top removed, you can see we've got mounting slots for mounting fans and radiators at the top of the case. So in terms of fans, it's up to two 140 or two 120mm fans at the top, or up to a 280mm radiator. If you're not planning on putting fans or radiators at the top, there is an acrylic panel that comes in the case accessory box, and I'll show you how to change it out. So we've got 6 screws we need to remove. With the 6 screws at the top removed, this panel is free to lift up and slide out. Then if you want, you can slot the acrylic panel in at the top. There's magnets on both sides which are just going to hold it in place. In terms of airflow, you're probably going to get better airflow with the mesh panel rather than the acrylic panel. But for the purposes of this build, I'm going to test out the acrylic panel first of all. At the end, I will do some thermal testing with the mesh panel as well. So I'm going to be able to tell you how much in terms of performance you lose by going with the acrylic panel. For the building process, I'm just going to leave this out for now. You'll notice on the top and the bottom of the case, we've got these handles. BitFenix do recommend you remove these during the building process to avoid scratching them. They're each held on with 4 screws, so we've got 2 here and there's also 2 on the back, and the same thing at the bottom. With the 4 screws at the top removed, we can slide the handle backwards, lift it out from the sides and lift away. And with the case turned upside down, it's exactly the same process to remove the feet. We can slide them backwards, lift them out and away. You'll notice at the bottom of the case we've got another magnetic dust filter which can simply be pulled away. To remove the front mesh panel, there's 4 little clips that we're going to have to free up. So if we push out on this clip and then we can pull the panel slightly away. Same thing with the bottom clip. And then over to the other side, if we push backwards here and here, we're then going to simply be able to lift the front mesh panel away. So the next thing I want to do is give you an orientation in the case. So the motherboard is going to go at the back here, upside down, and it comes with 4 standoffs pre-installed for a mini ITX motherboard, although we've got additional holes which will allow you to mount up to a micro ATX motherboard. The power supply is going to go at the front of the case, down at the bottom, and we've got a little bracket here to mount it in. Then the next thing to do is decide how you're going to mount your graphics card, and you've got two options for this case. You can mount the graphics card horizontally. It's going to go across here upside down, and obviously with your graphics card here, you're not going to be able to use the radiator mounting slot at the top, which is going to mean you're going to have to go with an air cooler. And air coolers up to a maximum height of 190mm are supported. The case does come with a bracket where you can remove this rear fan and fit a vertical GPU bracket, which means your graphics card is going to go vertically here. So although the bracket does come with the case, the riser cable doesn't, so you're going to have to pick that up at an additional cost. So with your graphics card mounted here, obviously you're not going to be able to fit an air cooler on the motherboard, but you are going to be able to take full use of this top mounting slot and fit up to a 280mm AIO. So in terms of fan support, you'll see the case comes with three 120mm ARGB fans pre-installed. The two at the bottom are set to intake and the one at the rear is set to exhaust. Taking a look at the front of the case, you can see we've got a 60mm fan pre-installed at the top, although there is space for up to two 60mm fans at the front. Because the power supply is going to go down at the bottom, you're not able to mount any fans here, but above the power supply, if you do remove the 60mm fan, there is space for a 120mm fan at the front. The other important thing to mention down at the bottom of the case, if you did want to remove the pre-installed fans, behind each of them there is mounting holes for either a 2.5-inch or 3.5-inch drive. What I'm going to do now is remove the bracket for our power supply, so it's held on with a thumb screw. And then once the thumb screw has been removed, the bracket can simply be lifted up and away. At the back of the case, we've got a removable bracket for mounting SSDs or 3.5-inch hard drives. It's held on with 4 screws, 2 at the top and 2 at the bottom. So with the 4 screws removed, the bracket can simply be lifted away. So on this side of the bracket, you're going to be able to mount up to 3 2.5-inch drives. And if we turn it round on the other side, you're going to be able to mount up to 2 3.5-inch drives. Now, if you do want to go with 2 3.5-inch drives on this side, you are actually only going to be able to mount 2 2.5-inch drives on this side. If you're only going with 1 3.5-inch drive on the back, you're going to be able to fit up to 3 2.5-inch drives on this side. And now we've got the hard drive bracket removed, you can see that actually cable routing space looks quite good at the rear of the case, with up to 44mm of cable routing space. So because I'm going with quite a big graphics card, I'm going to remove the 60mm fan at the front. If there's space at the end, I might add it back in again. The next thing I want to do is show you how to install the vertical GPU bracket. I'm obviously not using it in this build, but I will show you how to install it for completeness. So the first thing we need to do is remove the rear fan. It's held on with 4 screws. To remove the fan bracket at the rear, we simply need to remove the 2 thumb screws, and then the bracket can tilt it down and away. In the case accessory box, we get the vertical GPU support bracket. It simply slots into place, and then the same 2 thumb screws that we've just removed, we're going to put back into place to hold it. So that's going to allow you to install your graphics card in the vertical position. As I mentioned, I'm not going to do this, so I'm going to put the rear fan back in place. Next thing to do is add in the additional standoffs we're going to need for our micro ATX motherboard. So BitFenix do include a standoff insertion and removal tool, so we can pop the standoff into it and then screw it into place. Okay, last thing to do is pass all the cables coming from our fans through to the back of the case. We're now ready to start working the motherboard, and we're going to install our CPU, the CPU cooler, our M.2 SSD and our RAM before we install the motherboard into the case. To install our CPU, first of all we need to push this lever down and out and then all the way to the top, and then we can open up the socket cover. We can then drop our CPU down into the socket, lining the notches at the top and the bottom up with the notches on the socket. Once we're happy everything's lined up and our text is around the correct way, we can close the cover down. If we put a little bit of pressure on this bit over here, quite often the black bit of plastic will pop off. We'll put that into our motherboard box, and then we can close the lever down again to secure our CPU into place. Next we're ready to install our M.2 SSD, so we need to remove the two screws holding the heatsink in place. Next we can insert our M.2 SSD into the socket at a slight angle, and you'll notice that when we flatten it down, the same screw that's going to hold our heatsink in place is also going to secure the drive. If you're using the motherboard for the first time, you'll have some plastic protection on the back of the heatsink you're going to need to remove. This motherboard has been used before, that's why there's none here. Next we're ready to install our RAM, so we need to open the clips on all four of the RAM slots. If you've only got 2 sticks of RAM, it's the second and fourth one along from the CPU that you're going to want to use. Then it's just a matter of lining the RAM up with the slot. Once we're happy everything's lined up, it's just some firm pressure to put the RAM into place. And then it's the same thing with the other 3 sticks. Next we can insert the backplate for our CPU cooler through the back of the motherboard. And then we've got one of these standoffs to go onto each corner. Then we've got one of these little brackets to go on the top and the bottom, going through the middle hole labelled number 2 on each bracket. And then we can secure each of the brackets into place with a thumb screw. We can then add some thermal paste to the centre of the CPU. We can then lower our CPU cooler down into place, line it up with the bracket beneath, and then we'll screw it into place. Next we can set our fans onto the CPU cooler. Once we're happy we've got them in place, all we need to do is apply a little bit of pressure to the 2 clips on each side to get them to clip into place. And then same thing with our second fan, we'll slide it down into place between the 2 heatsinks. And then once we're happy it's in the right place, it's just a little bit of pressure to the clips to get them to go into place. And then the same thing at the top. Coming from each of the fans, we've got a 4-pin PWM connector, and with the cooler we've got a double splitter cable, so we can plug the connector into the splitter cable, and then also the one coming from our front fan. And that just leaves us with a single 4-pin PWM connector, which we're going to plug into our CPU fan header. Just before I do that, I'm going to wrap the cables coming from the splitter cable around the CPU cooler to shorten the cable length. And then we can plug the cable into our CPU fan header at the top of the motherboard. And then I'm just going to tuck the excess cable in underneath the CPU cooler. Just before we set our motherboard into the case, I'm going to plug in our 2 8-pin EPS cables to the top left hand side of the motherboard. The reason I'm doing it now is once the motherboard's installed in the case, access to these ports is going to be limited. We can then set the motherboard into the case, lining it up with the standoffs beneath. We're then going to want to use these screws with a little lip round the outside to secure the motherboard to the case. Next I'm just going to plaster EPS cable extensions through the cutout at the back. And I'm also going to go ahead and plug in the 24-pin cable extension. And then we'll just bring the cable through to the back. Next thing to do is get some of our front panel connectors plugged in. So starting off with our HD audio cable. So we'll line the cable up and push into place, and then we'll bring the cable through to the back of the case. We've got an ARGB header here in the middle of the motherboard, and the controller that comes with our fans is going to need to be plugged into here if we want our motherboard to control the lighting. If you don't have an ARGB header, that's not a big problem because it does come with a remote control which is going to let you adjust the ARGB. So I'm going to go ahead and plug this in, so we'll line the cable up and push into place, and then we'll bring the cable through to the back of the case where we'll plug it in when we're setting up our fan controller. So then we're going to want to plug in our front panel connectors. Because our motherboard's upside down, it might be a little bit confusing, but I'm going to start in the bottom row, which is actually the top row if the motherboard was up the right way round, but I'm actually going to use the current orientation that the motherboard is in. So the bottom row, working from right to left, we've got power LED positive and power LED negative. Next to that in the bottom row, we've got our power switch. Then moving up to the top row, again working from right to left, we've got HDD LED positive and HDD LED negative. And next to that, we've got our reset switch. into pins 3 and 4 from the right hand side. Next thing to do is install our power supply. This is a fully modular power supply because it comes without any of the cables plugged in. I've gone ahead and plugged the cables in that we're going to need. So I've plugged in a 24-pin cable. We've got 3 8-pin PCIe cables, which is what our graphics card is going to need. We've got 2 8-pin EPS cables to provide additional power to the CPU. And I've also plugged in a SATA cable. Although we're not installing any SATA drives, our fan controller is going to need SATA power, so that's the reason I've plugged it in. So one option to secure the power supply into the case would be to use the bracket we took off earlier on. So it simply just pushes in from the bottom of the power supply, and then we would use 4 of these larger screws to secure the power supply to the bracket. And then it would just be a simple matter of using the thumb screw to secure the bracket and the power supply back into the case. I'm going to show you a slightly different way to secure the power supply, and we can actually remove the bracket on the case, which means we're going to be able to secure the power supply directly in from the bottom, which is going to mean we have a little bit more room above the power supply for our graphics card. So we just need to remove these 5 screws. With the screws removed, the bracket is now free, but it is catching on this fan. So I'm just going to remove the screws, loosen this fan up, and hopefully be able to get the bracket out. Okay, so that's with the fan loosened up. We're able to slide the bracket down and out of the way. And then we'll just put the screws back into the bottom fan. We're now going to be able to slide our power supply directly into the case, and I'm going to make sure the fan is facing the front of the case. Just getting it past the 24-pin cable and sliding it all the way up to the top. And then we can secure the power supply in at the top using 4 of the larger screws. Next, we're going to have to open this cover at the top. We can bring our power supply extension cable through the cutout and then refasten the cover. And then if we bring our extension cable over and get it plugged into the bottom of our power supply. Now, 2 important points here. When you're using an extension cable for your power supply, make sure you have it turned on. And the other thing is our power supply has a hybrid mode, which is currently turned on. That means when the power supply is under low load, the fan will stop spinning, reducing noise in the PC, and I would recommend using this. You'll notice now with the power supply extension cable plugged in, the case won't sit flat because of the extension cable. So I think you have 2 options: either wait till later in the build to plug it in, or put the feet on at this stage. So I'm going to go ahead and put the feet on at this stage. We can then bring all the power supply cables through to the back. At the back of the case then we can connect up the 24-pin cable extension to the cable coming from our power supply. And we can also connect up the 8-pin EPS cables to the cable coming from the power supply. As well, at this stage, I'm just going to plug in our 8-pin PCIe cables to the cable extensions. And next thing I want to do is get our fans connected up. So coming from each of our 3 case fans, we've got 2 connectors. We've got a 3-pin power connector, which is going to control the speed of the fans and power the actual fan moving itself. And we've also got a 3-pin 5-volt ARGB connector, which is going to control the lighting on the fan. Fortunately, BitFenix do include a little controller, which is going to allow us to connect everything up. So we've got fan 1 all the way down to fan 6. So we're going to be able to plug 6 fans into here. And we've got LED 1 all the way to LED 7, so up to 7 LED lighting sources. So what I'm going to do is take our 3-pin connector and plug it into fan number 1. I'm going to take the one from our 2nd fan, plug it into fan number 2, and then the one from our 3rd fan into fan number 3. So we're going to be able to control the speed of the fans using the built-in remote control to adjust the speed in the controller. If you prefer to have motherboard control, you can of course plug these directly into your motherboard, but make sure to run them in DC mode because they've only got 3 connectors and it's only 4-pin connectors that you're allowed to run in PWM mode. Then over on the other side, we're going to take our ARGB connectors and plug them into the controller. So that's into LED 1, the next one into LED 2, and then our third one into LED 3. The case does come with 2 LED light strips. I'm not planning on using them, but I'll show you how to connect them up should you want to use them. So you're going to take the light strip, and there's this cable that comes with it, and just plug it in to the end. There we go. And then again, we've got another 3-pin 5-volt ARGB cable, which would simply plug into one of the LED slots on the controller. The light strips are magnetic, so they will stick to the case wherever you want, and you've also got double-sided adhesive on the back should you need to stick them somewhere different. So you remember when we plug our case cables in, we plugged one into an ARGB header on the motherboard. So this is the other end, and it just plugs into the header labelled Aura on the bottom of the controller and pushes into place. The other option you have here, we plugged our reset switch into our motherboard to allow it to have reset functionality. The other thing you could do is plug your reset switch into here, and then when you press the reset switch, it's going to cycle through the different ARGB effects. Now, because we do have a remote control, I'm going to use the remote control to control this and keep the reset switch for its intended purpose. We are going to need to power this controller, so there is a SATA cable that comes with it, which can simply push it into place. We're then going to plug the other end of the cable into a SATA cable coming from our power supply. And then BitFenix include this double-sided adhesive pad, which is going to allow us to stick our controller to the back of the case. So at this stage, just before we get our graphics card installed, I'm going to get our 2 additional front panel cables plugged in. So our USB 3.0 cable is going to go here. And then just below that, we've got our Type-C cable. We're now ready to install our graphics card, so we just need to loosen this cover here. And then we're going to need to remove the first and second slot cover for the graphics card. We can then open the PCIe slot, and then I'm just going to slide the graphics card in from the top. Next, we can line the graphics card up with the slot. Once we're happy everything's lined up, we can apply some firm pressure to the graphics card, and it's going to clip into place. And then we can secure the graphics card into place with the 2 screws we removed earlier on, and then slide the cover back into place and tighten up the thumb screw. Next, we can bring our PCIe cables back through the cutout and get them plugged into the graphics card. And then we'll use the included cabled combs to help organize the cables. So what you'll notice that with our GPU installed, we are able to get our 60mm fan back in at the front. Although I can go one better and actually fit a slim 120mm fan in at the front. So we bring it in from the side, squeeze it past the GPU. It is actually going to fit here and should provide us with better airflow. So I'm going to go ahead and install this one. And then we've got a fan header at the top of the motherboard that we can plug into. So this brings me on to the job that I have been dreading, cable management, although there does look like plenty of space here at the back we're going to be able to get the cables into. So that's the build complete, and I'm absolutely delighted with how it turned out. I've gone with my very traditional black and white themed build, and it looks absolutely great in this case. You'll notice I've gone ahead and set the PC up without recording the steps. The reason I've done that is I've set up lots of other PCs with MSI motherboards, and the process for setting them all up is very, very similar. So if you don't know how to install Windows, the drivers, the RGB software, check out my LANCOOL 3 build guide, and following along between the two, you'll be able to get the PC up and running and looking this good. So the PC looks good, but what about the temperatures? So our CPU idled at 36 degrees and reached a maximum of 99 degrees during a 10-minute AIDA64 stability test with up to 3% thermal throttling. Our GPU idled at 39 degrees and reached a maximum of 77 degrees during the AIDA64 stability test. In terms of noise levels, the average noise levels were 45 decibels at idle and 47 decibels under load. So putting those results in context, the CPU temperatures are actually pretty good. The 12700K is actually a pretty hard CPU to keep cool with an air cooler, and particularly during an AIDA64 stability test, and quite often it is in the high 90s. So the fact that we don't actually have a front fan in front of this air cooler, I was pleasantly surprised by those results. GPU temperatures are a bit higher than what I would expect them to be. I would be expecting this GPU in a well-ventilated case to run in the low to mid 60s. So it definitely is higher than what I would expect, but given the case's layout, it's not a big surprise, and it's actually slightly better than what I thought it was going to be, particularly with that acrylic panel on the top. In terms of noise levels, the PC is quite noisy. The fans, when I was setting up the remote control, I set them on the lowest setting where the fans were still spinning. One setting lower than that, and they stopped spinning altogether like I have them on at the moment, so you can actually hear me without any fan noise in the background. At the moment, the idle noise from the PC is only 30 decibels without the 3 fans spinning. So the 3 fans that come with the case running using the built-in controller are incredibly noisy, and that's the reason there's such a high idle noise level. The next thing that I did was replace the acrylic panel at the top with the mesh panel. Taking a look at how that affected the temperatures, there was no difference to our CPU's idle temperature, while it was 1 degree hotter under load with slightly more thermal throttling at 10% instead of 3%. GPU temperatures came down by 1 degree both at idle and under load, and there was 1 decibel of extra noise under load. The next thing I did was, keeping the mesh panel at the top, I removed the front intake fan. This resulted in our CPU idling 1 degree hotter, and it was 2 degrees hotter under the AIDA64 stability test with the same amount of thermal throttling. GPU temperatures were 1 degree hotter at idle and 2 degrees cooler under load. In terms of noise levels, there was 2 decibels less noise at idle and 1 decibel of extra noise under load. So I found these results quite surprising. I was expecting the mesh panel at the top to give significantly better results than the acrylic panel, but it means you can go whatever you think looks the best, because there's not that much of a difference in terms of temperatures. It was interesting to see that the front intake fan didn't actually make that significant a difference, and in fact under load the GPU temperatures were actually better without the front intake fan. So I think if I was building in this case, I would probably leave the front intake fan out. So now I want to share my thoughts on the case, having put a build together in it. And I think the first thing to say about this case is I think it looks absolutely stunning, particularly with the black and white theme that I have gone for. And it's quite unlike any other PC that I have built. So you're going to get the wow factor with it, and it's going to be something completely different. And I think that's probably the biggest thing going for this case. There is a few negatives to it. GPU temperatures aren't good. They're not awful, but they're definitely not good. They're in that sort of high moderate range, which you would get much cooler temperatures in a more straightforward case with a more traditional design. Noise levels also weren't particularly good, and it's due to these 3 fans running with the included controller. So again, I don't think if this was going to be my PC build that I would be happy with that amount of idle noise level, and I would either replace these fans or see could I get them running slightly quieter, plugged directly into the motherboard and adjusting the fan curves manually. 2 other things just to point out. Because of the orientation of this case, the side is going to be on a different side of your desk than what you're used to with a traditional case. So you're going to want to have this sitting over to your left hand side, whereas with most PC cases you're going to want to have it over to the right, and that may not work for you in your particular desk setup. The other important thing to remember is the I/O is on the rear side panel. So if you're going to have this up against a wall, it was going to block you plugging in any USB drives there. So just some things to remember. There's definitely pros and cons to every PC case. You can get a very stunning build, but it's not a perfect case, and there is a few negatives to it. But I really enjoyed building in it, and I think the PC that I've come up with looks absolutely stunning. So hopefully you have found this video useful. If you have, please remember to give it a thumbs up. And if you're not currently subscribed to the channel, please hit the subscribe button as well. Thanks for watching.